This story is about how Eowyn became a master gardener. Before Eowyn was born, an angel of kindness came to her, and it gave her a gift. The gift was a vessel of clay, brown, with green and gold engravings on the side and markings of ancient symbols. Along the outside, the rim was even. There was no spout, and the vessel was filled with sweet, sweet water. And the spirit of kindness said to Eowyn, "This is your gift. Keep it safe, keep it filled, and tell no one about it." And Eowyn, in her little spirit state, held out her arms and she received this gift, and it just merged and blended with her, and she was born. Now, as a little girl, Eowyn, she wasn't Now, as a little girl, Eowyn, she didn't think that she had a vessel. It was more like she was a vessel. You know, a deer doesn't look into its reflection in the water and admire itself. No, she was like a song sprung from the earth. And one of the things that she loved to do was she loved to follow her grandfather around because he was the master gardener of the town. She would follow him as he went down the rows, taking his hands and making holes. And she would follow him as he gently placed the seeds into the holes. And then she would sit on his plot of land and she would sing. She was such a joy. Time went by and seasons turned. One night, Eowyn went to bed like she always does. And when she woke up in the morning, she felt this hollowness in her heart. She felt something was wrong. She felt like something had been ripped from her. And even though it's kind of strange to look for something outside of yourself that used to be inside of yourself, she searched every inch of that room for her vessel because it was gone. All she could find were strange scratch marks on the sill of the door. Exhausted, she fell back into her bed and she cried. The saddest part of this is that in some way she blamed herself. She wept and then she cried all night, and finally she cried herself to sleep. And in the morning, she woke up and she completely forgot it ever happened. Time went by, seasons turned, and she grew up. She left her grandfather's tutelage, for she did get to have her own farm and her own land. She had this house with a porch that was covered so she could sit there any season, enjoy the beautiful weather, whatever it was. She would look out over her porch at her garden, and then she could look up on the hill on the other side where there was this old, old oak tree. This was everything she dreamed for, is everything she wanted, but it wasn't really, her garden, it wasn't growing the way she thought it would. And she would plant and she would do all the right things, and sometimes they grow, sometimes they would. Even her pails but had little holes in the top. It was hard to water. And every season, every year, her crops got a little bit smaller because she wasn't saving enough to plant for the next spring. Because Not because she didn't know any better, but because beggars would come to her door and she couldn't say good. She couldn't she couldn't hold them back. She couldn't say no. And then she'd get mad at herself and she'd tell herself she should hold some back, and she would. And then other people would come to the door, the tricksters, and they would spin these stories. And before she knew it, they were gone, and so were her goods. Ah, it wasn't really quite what she had hoped for. But let me tell you about that tree up on the hill. That tree that she may have given away if it didn't have roots in the ground. The villagers called it the blessing tree because it was so old that everyone could feel its magic. It was so old that the branches were 20 feet long at the bottom and leaning down almost to the ground. So old that when the children climbed up into it, which they did, they could find this hollowed hole where they'd put little trinkets and they'd whisper their dreams as their parents would hang offerings beautiful on the low limbs. Aelin felt like it was a blessing just to be able to be in the presence of this tree every day. And she would go climb it at night when no one was around. And she would look through the leaves at the stars and listen to the wind and the branches creaking. It was very comforting. And that's kind of how life was like for her. Time went by and seasons turned, and one year there was a drought, terrible drought. So bad that the earth was cracking. Eowyn prayed for rain, and she prayed and she prayed. Oh, and then the rain came in torrents, too much, because the soil was too dry to absorb it in time. She stood on her porch and she looked out and she could see this river of water coming in and flooding her garden. She saw a flash of light and she heard a crack and she saw that oak tree come crashing down. Without even a care, she tumbled off the porch and around the garden and through all that mud and up the hill. And she got up to the old oak tree and she slipped in the mud and she fell back and she saw in front of her that all of those trinkets the children had left in the offerings were scattered in the mud around her. And she picked up what had been in her hands where she'd caught herself, and she saw that she was holding in her hands these shards of clay with green and gold patterns and ancient symbols. And this triggered her memory. She remembered the spirit of kindness, and she knew whatever had happened was not her fault. She began to cry, and in her crying, she began to weep. And in her weeping, she began to keen. And she was keening and rocking, and a low moan came from her, and she started to sing this low moan. It was the first song she sang since all that happened. And it put her in this trance state that enhanced her senses, and she was able to see the thief that stole her vessel and smashed it after drinking that sweet water and hid it in the hollow of that tree. And she could see where he lived. This made her despair and sorrow turn into rage and fury, which sharpened her senses even more. And she could actually see where this thief lived and where his lair lay, for he was a fox. And in that moment, she decided that she was going to kill that fox. Without any care that the lightning was still coming down, Eowyn went down the other side of this hill and around the outskirts of town and down that long, lonely road into the forest, deeper, deeper, until she came to the fox's lair. And outside was a shed. She could see light coming through the slats in the wood, and she heard a noise. She crept up to that back door and she opened it silently. And when she looked, she saw a rows and rows of shelves. And on those shelves were many, many vessels, all inlaid with different patterns and different symbols, all beautiful in different ways. And with her sharpened senses, she knew that every vessel had sweet water in it and dreams. She looked down at the end of the row and she saw him. She saw that fox. He was drinking sweet water. He was smashing them under his feet. He was laughing. He was drunk. And he was dangerous. But Eowyn was more dangerous. For when she saw that, her heart froze like a dagger. And she took that dagger out of her heart and she raised it above her head and she went down the aisle, silent step after silent step on her way. There was a moment when the fox just disgusted her so much she had to turn away. And when she did, she saw herself in the reflection of one of those beautiful vessels. She saw two things. She saw the malice on her face. She also saw a thin membrane of a new vessel growing inside her. And she heard a voice of the spirit of kindness. And it said, Eowyn, if you do this, there's no going back. So Eowyn took every ounce of her energy and she reeled in that rage and anger, and she took one silent step back after one silent step back until she got to the door. And she fled deeper and deeper into the forest. She went far and she was gone so long. The villagers thought she was gone forever. But she wasn't gone. She was right here in the deep, deep forest. She made a new friend with an old maple tree, and she found old logs and leaned them up against the tree, and she would sleep in the shelter at night, and her despair would be absorbed by the earth and the roots of the tree. She cleared a little plot of land, and she went into the forest and brought out shoots that wouldn't have survived in the shade and put them in the light. She found an old bucket someone had left there so she could water her garden. And at night she'd climb up into the maple tree and she'd look at the stars under the leaves and listen to the wind and the creaking of the branches, and she would sing. And in the morning she'd come down from the tree and there'd be a little more shoots and a little more flowers. Time went by and seasons turned. And one day she was out there and she was watering her plants very carefully, and sweet water just poured out from her onto the ground, and then there were a little more sprouts and a little more flowers, and she thought, oh, and she realized that her vessel had come back or grown back, or it was there and it was full and strong, and she thought, maybe this is what this vessel is for. I think I'm going to water my garden with it. So she tried to do it again, and it didn't quite work because there wasn't that extra. And then, well, she'd have to either turn herself upside down or punch a hole. And she did not ever want to feel that way ever again. And then this realization came over her with a weight of safety. And she knew that this vessel only had two purposes: to hold and to overflow. To hold and to overflow. This gave her such peace that she knew it was finally time to go home. So she gathered her few belongings, and she even dug up some starters, and she made her way out of the deep, deep forest, out on the long, lonely road around that fox's lair and around the outskirts of town. And she was coming up to the hill where that oak tree lay. And my goodness, a lot of time must have gone by because there was already a new tree growing out of his mother's body. She went over the hill and she looked down at her garden. It was overwhelmed and overgrown, but that's okay. And she went down and even closer, and she opened up the door to her house, and a few of those tricksters were squatting in there. But she got rid of them. And she dusted and cleaned her house out and cleared the garden and tilled the land and put in the holes. And she found caches with seeds she'd hidden and put them in the holes, and took the starters from the garden and put them there. And then she watered them, and they grew. And then they flourished. And she would sit on her plot of land at night and she would sing, and they would flourish even more. And this is how life was for her. Time went by and seasons turned, and one day she was sitting on her porch just at sunset, just admiring the beauty of the land It was sun was setting, her garden was there, and she looked up at the tree and a couple of boys had come and they were climbing it because the village could sense that this tree was a new blessing tree. The magic was growing. And she knew that she had found what it takes to be a master gardener. As for that fox, well, he's still doing the same thing he was before. He's still thieving and drinking and smashing. Too bad, because if he had been silent long enough, he may have found something deep inside himself that could have slaked that terrible thirst.